Chapter 15, Stress, Health, and Coping. This chapter is comprised of 7 units: the nature of stress, gas stress and health, vulnerability and protective factors, coping with stress, health promotion and illness prevention, combating substance abuse, and positive psychology. So let's start with the nature of stress. So psychologists have viewed stress in 3 different ways: as a stimulus, as a response, and as an organism-environment interaction. And we'll be looking at a model of that on the next slide. Typical definition of stress is eliciting stimuli or events that place a strong demand on us, and we call those things stressors, right? Things that are, they can be things that we encounter in our daily lives, any events really. So micro stressors are known like daily hassles, right? Person situation interaction, transaction between the organism and the environment, and health indicators. In this person situation interaction model, stress is viewed more as a transaction between a person and the environment. So it's more complex than simply having a stressor or something that you're reacting to externally. It's about how that stimuli and your response and your cognitive appraisal of the situation, coping, everything sort of interacts to create our perspective of stress, right? Because some people find the same situation, one person could find overwhelmingly stressful, whereas another person may not find it stressful at all. Or another person may find it very stressful, but are able to cope with it, right? But it's the same situation. So this person situation interaction model helps to explain that. So we see here on slide 3, sorry, it's a little bit fuzzy. So this model shows stress involves complex interactions among situational factors, cognitive appraisal processes, physiological responses, and behavioral attempts to cope with the situational demands. Stressor characteristics, over on the left there, that increase stress responses are shown. Stressor characteristics include intensity, severity, duration, predictability, controllability, and chronicity. The lower panel shows potential cognitive, physiological, and behavioral stress responses that can interfere with well-being. So when we are faced with a stressful situation, first we have the cognitive appraisal, right? Cognitive appraisal of demands, of resources, of consequences of that, the meaning of those consequences. So we're thinking it through, right? And the effects of that would be to worry or have racing thoughts, so low self-confidence, perhaps expecting the worst, feeling of hopelessness. And then we move on to physiological responses. You would have your sympathetic arousal and stress hormones, which would result in muscle tension, elevated heart rate, shortness of breath, and increased susceptibility to illness. After that, we have the coping and task behaviors. For example, task irrelevant responses, behavioral rigidity or disorganization, which we talked about in the last chapter, self-destructive behaviors, for example, substance abuse or alcoholism. The text goes on then to sort of differentiate between catastrophic events and major negative events, right? And then also goes over a measuring stressful life events scale. The scale is here on page 575. And this is a self-report scale, right? It's used to study the linkages between life events and well-being, and to quantify the amount of stress that a person has experienced over a given period of time. It looks at, again, quantify stress over a given period of time, indicate whether a particular event occurred, the appraisal of the event, whether it's positive or negative, and then the person also indicates the amount of control, perceived control, and perceived predictability. Interestingly, it used to be thought of that any life event that requires adaptation, whether negative or positive, is a stressor. So you have, I remember seeing stress scales, and they'd even measure things like a wedding or a trip, or not so much a trip, moving, sorry, like moving locations, moving houses, whatnot, going to university, any life event could be a potential stressor. But, sorry, whether it was positive or negative, right? But later research has shown that only negative life events, only negative life changes, um, consistently predicted adverse health and behavioral outcomes. Okay? So, what happens when we encounter a negative stressful situation? The process of dealing with a stressful situation starts with our appraisal of the situation, right? You can have the exact same stressor affect people differently, like we just spoke about, um, and how you react to it, both uh, mentally and physically, depends on your appraisal. So the four aspects of the appraisal process include primary appraisal, secondary, judgments of consequences, and personal meaning. In the text, they use the example of a job interview. So let's just go over it that way. So you get a job interview and you're really nervous. It's really stressful, right? Um, you've got to go, you're going tomorrow. So your primary appraisal is demands of the situation. What do I have to do? Secondary appraisal, resources available to cope. How can I cope? Third, judgments of consequences of the situation. What are the costs to me? And then fourth, the personal meaning. What does the outcome imply? What does this say about my beliefs about myself and about the world? And let's look over how this person did. So with a primary appraisal to do with a job interview, you'll be thinking, how difficult this is going to be. What kind of questions are they going to ask? Is this going to be hard? How badly do I really want the job? Do I really need that? Right? And then you move on to the secondary appraisal, and that's your ability to cope with it. And you're thinking, wow, am I going to be able to do this? Am I going to be able to pull this off? Do I know how to answer the questions? Am I going to speak properly? Am I going to be so nervous and not know what to say or stutter? And at this point, you're thinking either A, the demands of this interview, I just don't have it. I don't have what it takes to do well, so I'm going to experience stress, right? If I feel like, yeah, I know my stuff, I know how to speak knowledgeably about this, I'm prepared for the interview, I researched the company, and I know that I can just, breathe and stay calm. So secondary appraisal, I think I'll be fine. You're less likely to experience stress. Then you look at the judgments of consequences of the situation, right? We're both going to the same job interview. I think I'm going to do well. I think I'm going to be okay. If I don't get the job, I'm not going to be able to pay my mortgage. I'm not going to be able to pay for my car. I'm going to lose my apartment. The horrible things are going to happen. You're likely to feel a lot of stress if you go that way. Or, what are the costs to me? If I don't get this job, meh. If I don't get the job, then maybe it just wasn't a good fit for me. It wasn't a good fit for me, and there's lots of other jobs out there, and I'm just going to keep trying. Right? So the second, obviously, less stressful. And then lastly, the personal meaning. What does the outcome imply? So basically, if I don't get this job, It means that I don't know what I'm talking about. It means I'm a fake, I'm a fraud, I'm not good enough. Um, I've wasted my time learning all of this stuff. Um, I'm just not smart enough, and they knew it. Or the personal meaning, again, it could be if I don't get the job, similar to number three, I guess. I could be thinking to myself, you know what, we just weren't a good fit. I know what I'm talking about. I'm good at this, um, but maybe that just wasn't the right job for me. I'm, I'm perfectly fine. So, two very different or many different appraisals of the stressful situation and the consequences that it can have for your health, basically. Next, we have chronic stress and the GAS. So, what's the GAS? GAS is General Adaptation Syndrome. So, it's the phases that we go through when we experience a stressful situation. Stage one is the alarm reaction, is when we shift to sympathetic. Sorry, too much talking this week. Stage one is characterized by the sympathetic dominance causing increased arousal, which is the alarm phase, right? When the fight or flight. This is the panic that sort of gets the body going. It's the alarm reaction, right? So the sudden activation of this alarm system gets the sympathetic nervous system going. It starts to release stress hormones by the endocrine system, and this has an activating effect on all sorts of parts of your body, like smooth muscles, organs, glands. It leads to an increased heart rate, right? And respiration, dilates the pupils, slows digestion. So all of these things are preparing your body to be able to react to the stressor, right? So that slows the digestion. The blood leaves the digestive tract and goes to your arms and your legs, so you're able to react faster. Increased heart rate, basically everything to get your body ready to go. Then you move on to phase two, which is the resistance phase. Here, the adrenal glands release epinephrine, norepinephrine, and cortisol to maintain the increased arousal. Now, your body can't keep this up, right? It can't go on indefinitely in this alarm stage. If the stress persists over a long period of time, the body's resources will become depleted and exhaustion will occur. Basically, the organism can no longer cope and is highly vulnerable to a breakdown. Now, alternatively, if the organism does deal with the situation, the parasympathetic nervous system functions to reduce the arousal back to a normal state. So in the next couple of slides, I've sort of gone over that for you and broken up the how the phases, phase one, phase two, and phase three follow each other, and sort of tried to make it a little simpler for you there. So there's phase one, fight or flight. Phase two with the resistance. Phase three with the exhaustion. Part two of the chapter gets into stress and health. How does it affect the health? So first we discuss the work of Searle and how his work inspired medical and psychological research to really dive into explore the effects of stress on both physical and psychological well-being. And what they found was some stressors are so traumatic that they have a strong and long-lasting psychological impact. And they dove deeper into that to see how stressful events can be on the body and what are the consequences of those. And this model on page 579 looks at what they found in their research is that there's a significant positive correlation between negative life event scores and psychological distress scores, such as depression. But as we know, correlation does not determine causality, For example, which comes first? Maybe the psychological depression is why they have such negative life event scores, or maybe they have negative life event scores causing the depression. You don't really know which way it's going. And so what they've suggested is that there's a possible third factor, neuroticism, that could be involved here. What is neuroticism? People who are high in neuroticism have a heightened tendency to experience negative emotions and to get themselves into stressful situations through their maladaptive behavior. Another study cited here by Focus and Soisa in 2017, they found a significant relationship between neuroticism, depression, and anxiety and stress. Sorry, the four: neuroticism, depression, anxiety, and stress. So what this sort of indicates too, and further supports that stressful life events, it's an ongoing transaction between people and situations and appraisals of those situations. It's a highly complex series of interactions. Okay, there we go. Slide on neuroticism. And then we sort of get into different types of consequences of stress. For example, they talk about post-traumatic stress disorder, which is a severe anxiety disorder that's caused by exposure to traumatic life events, right? So there's four major groups of symptoms that occur when you have PTSD. The first is severe anxiety, physiological arousal, and distress. The second, painful, uncontrollable reliving of events in flashbacks, dreams, and fantasies. Third, emotional numbing and avoidance of stimuli associated with the trauma. And lastly, intense survival guilt in instances where others were killed, but that individual survived. Some individuals with PTSD also show self-destructive and impulsive behavior. It's important to point out that you do not have to actually experience a traumatic event yourself to develop PTSD. You can observe a traumatic experience. So in the text first, they give the experience of Vietnam vets, saying that 27.8% of veterans developed PTSD after coming back from the war. But then it also goes on to talk about people like firefighters or paramedics or whatnot who are frequently exposed to traumatic events. They're at a higher risk of developing PTSD. Talks about residential school syndrome as a form of PTSD. And it also notes here that following exposure to severe trauma, women are actually more likely to develop PTSD than men are. So there's some gender differences there as well. Residential school syndrome, you can read that. Stress and illness. Stress can combine with other physical and psychological effects to influence a whole range of physical illnesses. Okay. So increase prolonged stress or intense stress can lead to an increase in chronic conditions such as arthritis, bronchitis, emphysema. It can also lead to an increased chance of developing health problems. And this increase in severity, the increased chance of having health problems, all has to do with the number of stressors. And the intensity of the stress. Like, for example, people who experience chronic stress from caring for a spouse suffering from Alzheimer's, they are actually at a significantly higher risk of developing their own health problems, right? Stressful marriages can produce, in one study, they found that the stress produced by marital conflict produced a decrease in immune function. Stress can also contribute to health breakdown. By being in a very stressful situation can cause people to behave in different ways, right? That increase the risk of their illness. So, for example, if somebody is a diabetic and they're usually keeping a close eye on their diet, they're maintaining their blood levels by having a proper diet and taking their medication. If they're under a lot of stress, they may stop doing that, right? They may forget to be watching what they're eating. They may forget to exercise because they're so stressed out doing other things. They could start drinking more, using drugs, sleeping less. There's all sorts of ways, maladaptive ways that people use consciously or unconsciously to cope with stress, and these can really deteriorate our health. All right, so that's parts 1 and part 2 of this chapter. We are at 21 minutes, so I'm going to stop here and move on to parts 3 and 4 a little later today.